Daniel Carter told his bride Elena to never go into that old barn. Those were the serious words he ever spoke to her after she arrived at his Montana ranch. The warning came out of nowhere, so Elena almost laughed. The old wooden barn was far from the house, leaning to one side like it had survived 100 storms. The paint had peeled off years ago. Tall grass surrounded it like a forgotten island. Elena asked Daniel what was inside the barn. Daniel's face changed away. He said there was nothing she needed to worry about. He never showed her the barn. He showed her the horses, the cattle, the river, and the mountain trail where he rode every morning. Whenever Elena looked at the barn, Daniel became uncomfortable. He told her to promise him that she would stay out of the barn. Elena promised. At first, Elena came to America thinking she was starting a life. She grew up in a Russian village where there were not many opportunities. She met Daniel online through a friend. They talked for almost 2 years. Daniel was kind, patient, and honest, or at least he seemed that way. After marrying him, Elena moved to Montana expecting it to be tough. Learning a culture was not easy, and living on a ranch was harder than she thought. Something about Daniel bothered her. Every week he would disappear for hours and come back from the direction of the barn. Sometimes at night Elena would see a light coming from the barn. One time she woke up at 2 in the morning. Found Daniel's side of the bed empty. She looked out the window. Saw him standing outside the barn with a lantern. He was just standing there, not moving, watching the barn like he was guarding a secret. When she asked him about it the day, he would not answer. He just said it was family business. Months. Autumn came to the ranch. The leaves turned gold and red. Elena tried to focus on her marriage. The mystery of the barn kept getting bigger. Then a big storm came to Montana, the one in years. Thunder shook the house and rain hit the roof. Wind bent the trees in half. Around midnight, Daniel got an emergency call from a neighboring rancher whose cattle had broken through the fence. Daniel grabbed his coat. Said he had to help. Elena asked him if he had to go out in that weather. He said the rancher would lose hundreds of cattle if nobody went. He kissed her forehead. Left. The truck disappeared into the darkness. For the time, Elena was completely alone. Lightning flashed across the sky. She saw something strange. The barn door was swinging open. The wind had blown it loose. Her heart started pounding. She remembered her promise. She was too curious. For a year she had wondered what was hidden in the barn. Now the door was open like it was inviting her. Elena grabbed a flashlight and raincoat. Ran to the barn. The storm almost knocked her over as she crossed the field. Mud stuck to her boots and rain soaked her clothes. The barn loomed in front of her, its door like a giant black mouth. When she reached it, she hesitated, then stepped. The smell hit her away. Dust, old wood, and a faint scent of paper. Her flashlight beams swept across the interior. There were no horses, no equipment, no machinery. Instead, she found hundreds of boxes neatly stacked from floor to ceiling. Each box was labeled with dates, years, names, locations. Elena was confused. She approached the box and found thousands of letters, handwritten and carefully organized. She opened another box. Found photographs. Another box had newspaper clippings. Another had police reports. Elena stared in disbelief. This was not storage. It was an archive documenting something that spanned decades. One photograph caught her attention. A young man stood beside Daniel. They looked almost identical. They were brothers. The back of the photograph said, Daniel and Jacob 2006. Elena had heard the name Jacob once years earlier, when she talked to an elderly town resident. When she asked about Daniel's family, the woman became uncomfortable. Whispered, Poor Jacob, before quickly changing the subject. Elena suddenly understood. Jacob was the secret. She kept searching and found maps covered with notes, witness statements, photographs of forests, rivers, and abandoned buildings. The walls were covered with pinned documents connected by strings. It looked like something from a movie. Then she found a newspaper clipping with a headline that made her blood run cold. Local rancher vanishes without a trace. The article was 20 years old. The missing rancher was Jacob Carter, Daniel's younger brother. According to the article, Jacob disappeared one summer evening after attending a town festival. No body was ever. No suspects were charged. The case eventually went cold. Elena sat down slowly. The mystery was not about hidden treasure or crime committed by Daniel. It was about loss, obsession, and a brother refusing to give up. Then she found something else. A locked metal box that appeared to have been recently used. The lock was already broken, perhaps damaged by age. She opened it. Found a small leather journal. The cover was. The first page had a name. Jacob Carter. Elena froze. This was not a copy, it was Jacob's journal. Her hands were trembling as she began reading. Most entries described ranch life. Work, dreams, plans. Then the tone. Jacob started writing about a local businessman named Walter Grayson. Jacob believed Grayson was involved in activities. Smuggling, land fraud, and threats against local ranchers. Nobody believed him. The final entries became increasingly alarming. Jacob wrote that he had discovered enough evidence to expose everything. Then came the last entry. If anything happened to him, look beneath the foundation of Grayson's old sawmill, that's where he hid the proofs. The entry ended there, no pages. Elena stared at the words, her pulse racing. 20 years of mystery, and perhaps the answer had been hidden along. Headlights suddenly appeared through the cracks in the walls. Daniel was home. Panic surged through Elena. She hurried outside. Daniel stepped out of his truck, and the moment he saw mud on her boots he knew. "You went inside," he said, not as a question. Elena. Rain continued falling around them. For seconds either spoke. Then Elena held up the journal. Daniel's face turned pale. He asked her where she found it. She said it was in the barn. Daniel looked like the ground had disappeared beneath him. He took the journal. His eyes moved across the familiar pages. When he looked up again, tears filled his eyes. He said he had searched for the journal for 20 years. Elena asked him why he did not tell her, and Daniel said it was because everybody thought he was crazy. He explained everything. Jacob had vanished when Daniel was 24, and the police investigated for months but found nothing. Most people eventually accepted that Jacob had simply disappeared. Daniel never believed it. For 20 years he spent every spare moment investigating, following leads, collecting records, interviewing witnesses, searching forests, and studying documents. His barn became an investigation headquarters. The town mocked him, friends told him to move on, and even family members stopped discussing Jacob. But Daniel could not let go. Jacob was his brother, and the last thing he told him was that he worried much. The morning Daniel and Elena drove to the abandoned sawmill mentioned in the journal. The structure sat in the woods, collapsed and forgotten. Nobody had visited it in years. Following Jacob's instructions, they searched the foundation. Hours. Then Elena's shovel struck metal. Clang. Both. They dug carefully. A rusted container emerged from the earth. Inside were documents, photographs, financial records. Everything Jacob had described. Enough evidence to prove Walter Grayson had operated a fraud scheme involving stolen land and forged ownership records. There was something even more important. A photograph showing Walter Grayson standing beside 3 men, one of them Jacob. The photograph was dated 2 days before his disappearance. Tucked behind it was a note. Jacob had secretly met Grayson hoping to expose him, but the meeting went badly. Jacob was really scared for his life. The evidence that came out changed everything around. The people in charge decided to look into the case. Some new investigators who are good at using science to solve crimes looked at the papers and documents from the case. They also went back to talk to the witnesses. Some old clues that people had forgotten about came up again. It did not take long for the investigators to find something. A man who used to work at the place but had retired came forward after he saw something about the case on the television. This man had kept quiet for a long time. But now that he was getting old, he felt bad about what he knew and decided to tell the truth. What he said changed everything that people thought they knew about the case. The man said he saw Jacob being confronted by some men who worked for Grayson near the sawmill. The men got into an argument. Things got out of hand. Jacob got hurt badly. The men were scared. They took Jacob somewhere else. The man who came forward did not know where they took him. What he said helped the investigators to keep looking for answers. A month later they found human remains in a part of the forest that they had not looked at before. They did some tests. Found out that the remains were Jacob Carter. It had been 20 years since Jacob disappeared, and finally people knew what had happened to him. The news spread quickly over Montana. The mystery that had been bothering the town for 20 years was finally solved. People who did not believe Daniel before now understood that he was right. He was not obsessed, he just wanted to find out what happened to his brother. The spring the town had a service to remember Jacob. A lot of people came, some of whom knew Jacob personally, and others who just wanted to pay their respects. Daniel was there with Elena. When the service was over, an old sheriff came up to Daniel. The sheriff took off his hat. Said, "I am sorry." Daniel was surprised. Asked, "What are you sorry for?" The sheriff said, "I stopped looking for answers." His voice was shaking. "We all stopped," he said. Daniel looked at the mountains. Said, "No, you were just doing your job." The sheriff said, "Still, I am sorry." He held out his hand. Daniel took it. The sheriff said, "Your brother is finally home because you never gave up." For the time in a long time Daniel smiled, and it was not a sad smile. Months later the old barn was still standing on the edge of the ranch. Everything inside the barn had changed. All the papers and documents were gone. The investigation was over. All the questions had been answered. One evening Elena went to the barn by herself. The sun was. It made the sky look orange. She opened the doors and went inside. The barn felt different now, it felt lighter and more peaceful. In the middle of the barn there was a picture of Daniel and Jacob when they were men. That was all that was in the barn now. Two brothers smiling at each other. Daniel came up behind Elena. Said, "It is funny." She asked. "What is funny?" He said, "I used to think that the barn held the answers to what happened to my brother." Elena held his hand. Asked, "What do you think now?" Daniel looked at the picture. Said, "Now I know that my brother was not in the barn." He put his arm around Elena. Said, "He was waiting for someone brave enough to look for him." They stood there quietly as the sun shone through the wooden walls of the barn. The mystery that had been going on for 20 years was finally over. In its place there was something stronger than the feeling of loss. The truth was finally out.